This week on Waterways, exploring the Everglades. Winter comes to Everglades National Park, and 4 South Florida naturalists set out on a special journey to explore the park's diverse habitats and to document its variety of plants and animals, many found nowhere else in the country. The naturalists start their day near park headquarters, a few miles west of Homestead and Florida City. Their goal is to make their way down the main park road and conclude their day on the edge of Florida Bay, near Flamingo. The bay is just 38 miles distant, but from a naturalist perspective, it's a world apart from where their adventure begins. As they explore, they will discover places that may seem wild and uninviting to some, but which hold treasures that only an intimate experience can yield. They'll keep a written record of the plants and animals they discover, and challenge themselves to learn more and more about the park's biological wonders. Their first stop is the Old Ingraham Highway and the Hole in the Donut, which was once infested with a non-native shrub, Brazilian pepper. In the 1990s, the National Park Service had the invasive plants removed and heaped them into a massive temporary mound. Surrounding the mound are wetlands, which have become a spectacular home to birds of all shapes, sizes, and colors.
We've seen white pelicans this morning, hooded mergansers, wading birds of several types, great blue herons, tricolors. This area here, and in fact the Ingraham Highway, 10 miles out, all along is great for wildlife, particularly water birds and amphibians and reptiles in the canal that parallels the road. And the sense of solitude that you can get in this area is equal nowhere else in the park that's this accessible. You can ride a bike or hike out this Ingraham Highway and not see another person and just hear the wind and hear the sound of the wildlife, and the sound of the city is left behind.
The naturalists don't need a lot of equipment for their journey. They carry binoculars, field guides, checklists, and notepads, plus the necessities: sun and insect protection, and water. It is also important to bring a park map, which along with other information can be obtained at the Ernest Cove Visitor Center near headquarters.
This park is known for its diversity in kinds of places and biology itself, plants and animals. And one way to appreciate that and have fun doing it is to sort of document the things you see. And if you do that, you come up with a pretty long list. Now, we're in an area where we've been concentrating on birds. You can come out and actually make a list. And as you do that, you're having fun. It's kind of like a scavenger hunt. You end up appreciating and discovering the diversity of this place. A lot of people at first in the Everglades, they look around and they don't think they see a lot. Well, they're seeing a lot, it's just not registering.
In addition to basic equipment, the naturalists must possess things less tangible, such as patience and keen eyes, because they know that nature works according to its own schedule. Just as they prepare to leave, a peregrine falcon appears and scares up a flock of sandpipers. It's a rare treat, but it's well worth the time they've spent at the first stop on their Everglades exploration. The 4 naturalists stop next in the pinelands. This habitat is dominated by slash pines, but it's home to many other plants, some of which are endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else in the world. The pinelands area is crisscrossed with old roads, which today serve as hiking trails. These pathways are enjoyed by botanists and by anyone seeking natural solitude from the hectic pace of heavily populated South Florida.
This effort to list things and make a list and see the biodiversity, you could wear yourself out in the pinelands listing plants. A lot of shrubs, a lot of big trees. Everglades is the kind of place that doesn't quite know if it's wet or dry or temperate or tropical, and that's reflected in the plants and animals. Most of the diversity we see in the landscape in the Everglades is plants, differing plant communities. In fact, it's a mosaic of contrasting plant communities. And it's that way because of a lot of reasons. Geology itself and elevation and our seasonal water cycle, making some places wet, some places dry, some places alternately wet and dry, setting up totally different conditions for plant growth, and that's reflected in the visual that we get.
South Florida's pinelands, to the untrained eye, may look a lot like pine forest in places like Montana, Michigan, and Maine. But they're unique in the United States and tell a special story, even within the Everglades.
The pinelands has over 20 species of endemics that are unique to the rock pineland, actually. To having a high number of endemics in a particular kind of habitat implies that the habitat has been here a long time and isolated, and yet the Everglades, as an ecosystem as we know it today, is only 5,000 years old. Well, it turns out probably that the wetland plants and the tropical species come and go, but the rock pinelands themselves have been here longer. Off of Key West, 35 feet under the ocean, is evidence of a rock pineland complete with fire, a necessary component of this ecosystem, 8,500 years ago. So when you think that the rock pineland has been here for a lot longer than the Everglades itself, then we begin to see why we have the high number of endemics here, because we realize that this pineland has been in existence and isolated as a special kind of pineland, a rock pineland, for much longer than the Everglades itself as we know it has been here.
The scientific and ecological information abounds when one looks at the Everglades pinelands. However, sometimes it is better to close the books, let your mind rest, and soak it all in.
You don't need a guide at all. Certainly a little knowledge and a little bit of reading before you come, if nothing other than the park brochure. But walking down these trails just by yourself, armed with nothing more than binoculars and the brochure itself, you come out here and just use your senses. And sense it, listen to it, smell it, look at the diversity.
In the middle of the Everglades, the naturalists stop to explore the park's freshwater habitats, a cypress dome and the vast marsh. They're prepared to get wet and to venture boldly into the realm of the snake and the alligator.
Basically, anybody, you can walk anywhere in the Everglades. You don't have to be on a trail, and you can just walk out here through the marsh, through the sawgrass. It is best to have long pants and socks and shoes, and lace up closed-toed shoes because the mud will suction off your shoes. And you do need to be careful of the sawgrass that's out here. It can cut you. It's got a very sharp edge to it.
Regarding the park's reptiles, there are snakes and alligators, and it's wise to keep an eye out for them. But even venomous snakes and big gators normally don't want to tangle with people. If you see one, give it a wide berth and leave it alone, and it will be inclined to do the same. Very few people who practice a healthy respect for the park's wildlife experience dangerous encounters. But it's the diversity of life, its amazing natural history, and the untamed beauty of the place that dominates the naturalist's thoughts.
These trees here, we always get folks asking why are all these dead trees out here in the Everglades? And actually they're cypress trees and they're deciduous conifers. And so they drop their needles in the dry season and start to grow them back. Later in the dry season, it doesn't quite coincide with the wet season, but they're very much alive. They've just lost their needles for the winter. All right, so now we're in the cypress dome, and this is a real classic dome, and the term cypress dome comes from the shape of it from the outside, and it's higher in the center and tapers off towards the edges. And this one has a real classical appearance. You've got the high trees right in the center and shorter trees out towards the edges, and the dome actually creates its own habitat. And as you can see, we're standing in much deeper water here than we were out in the marsh and the sawgrass prairie.
In many respects, the cypress domes of the Everglades share similarities with cypress swamps elsewhere in the temperate deep south.
This Spanish moss is what, and the cypress domes is what people really think of when they think about the swamps and the southeastern U.S. And this really gives it that classic swampy look with the dangling Spanish moss and the tall cypress trees.
But many of the plants and trees of South Florida's cypress domes come from the Caribbean and are found nowhere else in the U.S. The beautiful bromeliads, relatives to the pineapple, are just an example. The naturalists turn their attention to the sawgrass marsh, which they discover is home to a lot more than just sawgrass. Periphyton, which is found everywhere, isn't much to look at, but it's the foundation of life in the marsh.
It looks slimy and gooey, and it kind of is, but it's hundreds of different types of algae that all grow together. Green algae, blue-green algae. One thing is it's a food source out here in the Everglades, and it's kind of the bottom of the food chain, and the periphyton is food for the apple snails and a couple other snails that are out here, but the apple snail is one of the classic ones that eats the periphyton.
Harsh, unpredictable forces in the Everglades present a challenge to the survival of its residents. During the dry winter season, nourishing water can disappear from much of the landscape. Periphyton, unexciting as it is, can help to rescue the marsh and the web of life it sustains from disaster.
So this is going to form a protective blanket over the Everglades and keep the soil from drying out entirely and blowing away. It also creates kind of a refuge for some of the animals that live out here, especially the insects. It's a place for them to lay their eggs, and perhaps the top layer will get dry and crusty, but underneath it'll stay moist. And that's really important, and a lot of those animals or critters are able to survive until the rains come again in the spring.
The group discovers other residents of the marsh, some with fascinating life histories.
One of the other cool plants that we get in here is the bladderwort. And it's a free-floating aquatic plant. So by pulling it up, I'm really not hurting the plant, just got to be gentle with it, but it produces this real pretty yellow flower on it. But the really interesting thing about the bladderwort is that it's a carnivorous plant. And so it gets its name because it has these very tiny bladders, about the size of a pinhead. And these bladders have little hairs on the end of them, and when something swims past it, it triggers the bladder to open, and it causes it sucks in the water and anything else with it. Hopefully some small aquatic creatures, and then the plant's able to digest that. So it's both carnivorous, and it also has the leafy green parts that are going to photosynthesize.
As the day unfolds, the group makes its way further down the road, and they enter the mangrove swamp. The bizarre mangroves, forming a nearly impenetrable and seemingly endless tangle, make for tough walking. It's been said that the record for the 100-yard dash through the mangrove swamp was accomplished in 22 long minutes. Even the four adventurous naturalists choose to take the easy way through this habitat. They stop at Westlake, where a boardwalk conveniently transports them into the swamp.
Here we're in a mangrove swamp. Mangroves occur only in South Florida in the entire United States. It's a very unique habitat because it has these trees, mangroves, that are specially adapted for living in or near salt water. You take one of your household plants and put it out in this environment and it's not going to survive. But the mangrove trees, the three that we have here in South Florida, the red, the white, and the black mangrove, all have ways to eliminate salt from their system or prevent it from coming in the first place. This is the black mangrove, the darker bark, and these little snorkel roots that are sticking out of the ground, pneumatophores, they come out from underneath the ground from the root system of the plant and aid in in gas exchange.
The mangrove swamp is a rich nursery ground for many species of fish and shellfish, which find food and sanctuary among the tangled mass of roots.
If you could look at the red mangrove branch here and the yellow leaf that is about to fall, those yellow leaves are going to form detritus, an organic matter in the ground that's a food source for the base of the food chain.
Much of the life in the mangrove swamp comes from the tropics. The leather fern, mangrove rubber vine, snook, mangrove cuckoo, and the American crocodile. The mangrove zone is home to unique life, and it leaves the visitor with a unique impression.
And this is just a spooky place that when you canoe through a mangrove swamp, there's a tangle of roots that you have to canoe through, and at times you're bending back and sideways to get around the prop roots, and there's spider webs across the trail many times, and you know, it's a habitat that's a natural habitat for snakes, so there is kind of an eerie feeling to a mangrove swamp. It's very unique.
Next up for the intrepid explorers is the Bear Lake Trail near Flamingo, home to a tropical hardwood hammock, a term which refers to a jungle-like forest growing on a high, dry ground and supporting an enormous variety of tropical plants and trees. This habitat is unique in the United States to South Florida. The group takes time to investigate the Caribbean trees and to discuss their amazing natural history. The manchineel tree, for example, is infamous for its caustic sap, which can cause a burning, blistering reaction when it contacts people's skin. Recognition of this tree, along with toxic poison ivy and poisonwood, is important to anyone wishing to explore beyond the roads and trails.
Manchineel, we have another one here, is interesting. It has an interesting history because it was considered such a villain tree due to its toxic sap that there was an effort years ago to remove as much manchineel as possible here in South Florida. And this is a great example of a tree that you won't find anywhere else in the United States but South Florida. This is a Caribbean emissary. So there was an effort to remove a lot of these trees throughout the Florida Keys, southern mainland of Florida, to the point where it's become quite rare. In fact, the state of Florida has listed the manchineel as an endangered species.
Most people who try to unravel the identification of South Florida's trees find it extremely challenging. The number of species is incredible, and the trees can look remarkably alike. Regardless, once you get to know them, you get to know their stories.
And Jamaica dogwood, it's also called the Florida fish poison tree. The Calusa Indians of South Florida, the original inhabitants of this area before the Europeans arrived, would remove the bark and leaves of this tree, and they'd often crush it up, throw it in the water, and the tree contains a toxin that can asphyxiate or can kill fish. Fish would float to the surface and the Indians would scoop them up, so it was their way of catching fish.
Like the manchineel, the cinnamon bark, sporting beautiful, red, velvety-looking fruit, is quite rare.
This tree, along with about 50 other species in South Florida, is listed by the state of Florida as an imperiled species, meaning these trees are either endangered or threatened because of their very restricted range and the amount of development that's occurred throughout their range. In South Florida, there are about 125 different species of trees, and about 100 of those are found nowhere else in the United States but South Florida. This place is incredible in terms of its diversity of tropical plants and trees, just unbelievable.
The end of the road, Flamingo, on the edge of Florida Bay, which makes up about 1/3 of the park's total area. It's a huge body of salt water, connected to the Gulf of Mexico along its western side. The bay is interspersed with shallow basins and even shallower flats, and it serves as a habitat for countless species of marine plants and animals.
This is a completely different habitat than everything else that we've seen along the way today. And here we've got salt water and mangroves, seagrasses, and it's a great area for birds, especially at low tide, which we have right now. It's very low tide, and it exposes all these mud flats and becomes a great feeding area for a lot of the wading birds and shorebirds.
It's probably one of the best fisheries in this country based on its year-round nature, the number of species that can be targeted and caught, and the style of fishing that's available. You can entertain a world-class fly fisherman 100 yards from a kid with a shrimp under a popping cork. And just south of us, a few miles, is a place called 9 Mile Bank, the only place I know of where you can, you have a good chance of catching a redfish and a bonefish in the same location.
The bay is also home to sharks, lots of sharks. Needless to say, swimming isn't recommended in the Flamingo area.
And as an angler, if you put a large bait down out here, a live pinfish or a ladyfish head, generally you don't have to wait but about 5 minutes and you're hooked up to something that's going to take 100 yards of your 12-pound tester real quick.
To truly understand Florida Bay, you have got to get out in a boat. Surrounded by life, you'll come to appreciate the bay's importance, its vastness, and its beauty. The 4 South Florida naturalists have spent a long but very fulfilling day exploring Everglades National Park. They ventured into its diverse habitats, from wetlands to pine forests, from mysterious mangrove swamps to jungle-like hammocks, ending up at a huge, shallow marine bay. They've seen flora and fauna from the temperate north and the tropical south. They've documented about 300 species of plants and animals, but they've just scratched the surface of all that's out there. Whether a person spends only a day or an entire lifetime exploring the Everglades, he or she will never stop learning about and appreciating the great wealth of life that makes Everglades National Park such a wonder to behold.